Alan asked me to introduce my brother, since I probably knew him as well as anybody. He's my little brother. He's 11 years younger than me, but he's bigger than me. And he's been able to accomplish some things that I never will. Columbia isn't the only place that he's been outside of our country to teach the gospel, but he'll tell you about that. But I want to say a couple of things about the congregation here at Highway 65 first. This is the only place that Carolyn and I have ever been where the church had the resources to do some of the things that are done here by you folks at Highway 65. Because of the giving and because of the members here, we're able to help preachers in a lot of foreign countries. And off the top of my head, I can come up with places in Africa like Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone, and maybe other places in Africa, the Philippines. We've been helping support a man in Romania. And South America is one of the more recent places, probably because of the connection that I have with Vernon and Carl McMurray. For the last 3 or 4 years, I think we've been able to help in that effort too. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about Vernon because he could get even with me. He probably knows some things about me that I'd rather he didn't tell. But we served together as elders in Indiana for about 5 years before we moved here. And Vernon and I have always gotten along really well. He's about 11 years younger than me, so when I left home to go to school, he was a little kid. And I really didn't know him too well until he grew up and I grew up and we came to know each other a little bit better. But with that, I'll call on Vernon to come up here and tell you about the work that he does in Columbia. I think it's an encouraging report. We see things out of some of the churches in Columbia that we don't see in other foreign countries. Some of the churches actually have elders and deacons and support their own preacher. And I'll not get into his presentation, so come on up, Vernon.
I'll just tell you one memory from when I was younger. Daryl and I used to have a double bed that we slept in. Mom and Dad bought twin beds because I wet the bed. I guess Daryl complained. I don't know. I want to start out by thanking you all for supporting us. If you're familiar with the treasury here, you're probably thinking, Vernon White, we've never sent him a check. And that is true. You've always sent checks to Carl McMurray. And he's the preacher where I attend, and he's the one that got me involved in foreign work. So you've been sending the money to him, but we have an agreement when we're in another country and one of us runs out of money, the other one picks up the slack. So you have helped me, whether you know it or not. In 2016, we encountered Calvin Slaybaugh. I don't know if you know that name or not. He preaches in Mishawaka, Indiana, northern Indiana, way up near the border. And he has been involved in the work in Columbia for 25 years. There's so much work that needs done down there that he's always recruiting new people. So he had run into Mac and recruited him, and I was invited to go along with him. So that's how I got involved in this work. And I just want to get right into it because I've got some things to talk to you about. Because of the number of years that I've been there now, there's an awful lot of pictures that I have, so you wouldn't want to see them all. You'd be here a long time, but I think I can hold this down to a couple hours. Columbia is a lot different than the United States in some ways. In some ways it's similar. You can be in places where it feels pretty modern and sort of like what we're used to, not exactly, but similar. I'm also a little nervous talking about Columbia this time. I understand you have some members here that have been there. Normally I can just say anything I want and nobody knows the difference, but if I call a town the wrong name, you might straighten me out if you notice it. But anyway, I just want to give you a glimpse into the past of other years, and then I'll spend most of my time talking about this year. We did travel to one congregation where we actually loaded the truck we were traveling on 3 canoes and hauled it across the river. That's the way they ferry vehicles back and forth at that location. We've baptized in rivers. That was actually on the way back from that very same trip. We were able to baptize a guy named Freddie in that very river, and that's always an exciting time. It's not so much fun getting in their rivers. If you think our rivers are polluted in the United States, you haven't seen anything. They're pretty much just open sewers. And so it's pretty despicable. I'm sure my doctor would tell me not to get in them, but what are you going to do? We've also traveled by dugout canoe. If you're not familiar with that, that's the kind of canoes that American Indians have, where you take a log and hollow it out and make a canoe out of it. That one had been made a long time ago and was rotting out. We were visiting a member of the church on the other side of the river, and we hollered at her across the river after we had hiked out there to where they lived, and she came across and got us. You can see the fella in the white shirt bailing water out of the canoe. That's because it was so rotten at one end. The whole time we were going, water was running in, so he was bailing so we would stay on top and get across the river. Where we went to her home and had dinner. I'll tell you, the people in Colombia are some of the happiest people in the world. They get ranked that way when they do studies on it. They're normally number 1 or number 2 in the world for happiness. It's not based on income or the blessings that they have in the way that we think of physical blessings, but they are so happy and so generous. They don't have anything, as you can tell from the pictures, most of them, but they will share whatever they have. That was my lunch or dinner that night. Poor photography. I'm sorry, my finger's in that picture. But they caught that fish right out of that river. That's a cereal bowl, so you can see what size my portion was that night. Normally you get more food than that, but that was pretty much all I wanted, because there were pigs and chickens running around at our feet and naked children, and I didn't really want to eat. But anyway, they shared what they had, and they were so happy that we came out to visit them. I also heard when I went there that piranhas are dangerous for evangelists. And so one of the first things I did when I went there is I ate a piranha. I wanted to show them who was boss. That was my Sunday dinner one day, actually in a pretty nice restaurant in a little town that we were at. Sometimes we go clear to the end of the road, and then we walk even further. So this is a place where we drove till the road ended. We walked a mile or two and went out on a guy's farm. He raises rubber trees, and they meet on his property under some banana trees. They were really excited the day we were there. They'd finally gotten up a galvanized roof. A lot of the churches down there don't have sidewalls. They'll just have a roof. And so they were excited to be able to show that off to us. I mean, there were 30 or 40 Christians out there in what feels like to us the middle of nowhere. But people are anxious to hear the gospel in Colombia, and we'll talk a little more about that as we go on. Also, last year you helped us go down up the Amazon River. We went to the southern tip of Colombia and got on the Amazon River in what appears to be a floating school bus when you're on the inside. Has a double seat on each side. Each seat's wide enough for about a person and a half. And I always had the aisle seat, so I had a half a seat and rode in that all day for 2 days, about 8-hour days. We went to Requena, Iquitos, several cities down through there. Requena was a little town. The furthest one we went to, that's about 500 miles from Colombia. And you have brothers and sisters there living in that town. That's the conditions that they live in. This is the congregation that was there for Bible study the night we were there. They meet with a dirt floor in a little shack along the river. But as you can see, they have a pretty fine pulpit. I don't know how they pulled that off. People there were probably the poorest I've seen of anywhere I've visited down there. They're just absolute poverty-stricken. But they knew that on the way back we were going to visit another congregation that was just getting started. And they knew that that congregation did not have a pulpit. They had hand-built a pulpit for us to carry back on that boat. It was smaller than that one, so it was easier to haul. Well, it was a beautiful piece of workmanship. I don't know how they pull that off out in the middle of nowhere, but they did. And so let's get to this year's trip then. There's a map so you can kind of orient yourself as to where we were. The purple arrow, is that what it shows up for you? Yeah, that looks purple to me, down at the bottom. That's the very southern tip of Colombia. It goes all the way up to the sea, and that's about a 1,000-mile stretch north to south. You also see a red arrow there that points to Macoa. We're going to talk about that first. Macoa was where we went. We had 3 places that we went this year. We've been going with Calvin until this year, and Mac and I decided to go on our own. We won't get into the reasons, but it just seemed easier that way this year. So we decided that instead of doing Calvin's method of constantly pushing to see how far out in the bush you can get, we were going to back up. We have several friends, and we wanted to go back and support those congregations and encourage them. And so the first place we went was Macoa. Where the purple arrow is the town of Leticia. Armando and his brother-in-law, Eduardo, preached in Leticia. But there was a couple converted in Macoa. They were converted right out of the tribal peoples. They have a son that's handicapped, and the first thing they did was they went to the shaman, and they spent months and months praying to trees and praying to waterfalls, just all kinds of things like that, trying to get this young boy healed. Of course, they didn't get anywhere. So then they started going to some charismatic type churches around town, and they were promised that those churches could heal that young man. Didn't come true, disappointingly. So in the process of attending those churches, Oscar decided or understood that he needed to be baptized. So he went to the people at the charismatic church and he said, I want to be baptized into Christ. And they said, okay, we'll put you on the list. Next time we have a baptismal service, we will baptize you. Well, that offended him. He knew he needed salvation, and he needed it then. So he walked away from that group, and they stayed at home then for a while. They were talking to a family member about that, and that person knew of the Church of Christ and introduced him to a preacher who was several hours away, but came down for a week and worked with them. He taught them the gospel of Christ, and they were baptized, both on the same trip. And for over a year, Oscar led worship services, having no experience doing that sort of thing, in his living room with him and his wife and his children, waiting for somebody to come and work with them. Just an amazing couple, an attitude towards the Lord like you've never seen. It was a pleasure to be in their home. I really enjoyed that. And so when Armando left Leticia and went over there to work, he took his family, so there's 2 young families down there and several young children, and they invited us to come over and visit them and encourage the brothers and help them speak. So we went and visited Macoa. Macoa's airport is the very edge of the rainforest. That runway is a single runway. There's no tower. You don't tell anybody you're coming in. You look down there and see there's nobody on the runway, and you land, and you go to the far end and turn around and come back to the little shack that serves as a terminal. So quite an experience. If that runway was your driveway, I'm sure you would have it repaved. It was a rough landing, but it worked. That's where the preacher lives. Armando and his family live there. We were standing around outside because they were cooking over a fire there. Most of the people cook that way. A lot of them don't have cook stoves, and so you cook over fires a lot. And they were very gracious in that home. This is the after services at Oscar's house where we met. Those were the people that were there that morning. There was the 2 couples, all their children. A couple of guests worshiped with us that day. And I understand that since we left there in January, they've converted another couple. So there's another whole family in that. That church is growing rapidly, at least by percentages. Armando also travels each week up to Villa Garzon, which is near the airport that we landed at, that I showed you a picture of. And he has family members up there who have started a Bible study group in their home. They meet once a week and study the Bible together. He's teaching them the gospel, and I also understand that those 2 people that were baptized are from his family and out of that group, now worshiping with them in Macoa. So Macoa's work is exciting. Looks like good things are going to happen there. They're making a lot of contacts. People are really anxious to hear the gospel in Colombia. I can't explain to you why their attitude is so much different than in America. Maybe because they feel the need for the Lord more than we do. Most of us have everything we need, we think. And so we just don't really reach out for help like they do. But they're excited when you want to talk to them about the gospel. If you knew about Macoa, you probably would know about it because a couple of years ago it made the news up here. There was a huge mudslide in the mountains, destroyed 10 neighborhoods. That picture at your left, the upper left, was actually a housing neighborhood, and there's no evidence of homes there now at all. The mudslide came through and wiped it out. The government, being socialist, likes to minimize disasters, and so they claim that 200, maybe as many as 300 people died. The people in the town say they hold flatbed truckloads of bodies out of there for days. They estimate something in the low thousands died in that landslide. So it was a real disaster for that city. You can see the sign there that tells them not to return, that the first thing is your life, protect your life. There were millions of dollars given by the government to rebuild their homes, and all of that money disappeared. So people are out there in the riverbed picking through, finding construction materials, and putting back together shacks to live in and returning to that place. It's the only place they know to go. They don't know any different. And that was the two brothers that were working there at that time when we left. We left Macoa then and went back up north. You see the circle is around Bogota. If you're familiar with Denver being a mile high city, Bogota is a mile and a half high. So it gets pretty chilly there, in spite of the fact that you're right near the equator and the temperature's 95 every day. It's not unusual to see 50-degree nights in Bogota. We went through Bogota, landed, rented a car, and drove up to Sahagún. We flew to Monteria and then flew to Sahagún. Sahagún is just north of Cartagena. It's up in the northern part of the country. It's up there where the green arrow is. Interesting story about Sahagún is that Brother Artenio, let's go to that slide so I can show you. Brother Artenio is a man in his late 70s who was a Pentecostal preacher, had a congregation that he led there in Sahagún. He got to listening to a Church of Christ radio program that's put on by some of our institutional brethren, and he learned the truth about how a person obtains salvation and realized he'd been preaching it wrong his whole life. He came over to the Church of Christ and brought his congregation with him almost exclusively. They've almost all been baptized now. They've been members of the church for several years. And he works starting congregations out in the jungle around where he lives. I've been to several of those places with him. The one where I showed that we were walking to it, we were actually traveling with him. And they met the first time I went there in the thatch roof building that you see them sitting there in. They've now built a new building adjacent to his house. And there's the interior of it. We were there holding. What he has decided to do is have a preacher conference each year. And so far, he's invited Mac and I to speak both times that he's done this. We'll see how that goes after this year, and I'll explain why. He invites preachers from all around the area, and almost all of those are from churches that were started by the institutional brethren. You wouldn't be able to recognize the difference if you visited their congregation. They have no money anyway, so they don't spend money on anything they shouldn't. They can't even hardly afford to support their own preacher. But they are supported by and they're receiving teaching from institutional churches here in the United States. The biggest problem they have, according to our brothers, is that they have preacher schools that the church contributes to that teaches young men how to preach, and so we're trying to lead them away from that. And Artenio is trying to get more of the brothers in Colombia to come to the same understanding so they can come together and work together. And we've been allowed to speak there. It's very exciting. These men are very open Bible students. They just really they pay attention like you wouldn't believe. They turn to every page you mention in your Bible. They're very good Bible students. And I was privileged to get one of the last lessons there this time, and we decided that I would tackle the subject of how you use the treasury and use it properly. You know, that's one of the biggest problems that separates the churches of Christ, is that we're careful to only spend money on things that we can authorize from Scripture, and some of our brethren, in our opinion at least, are not so careful. And they'll spend things to do things like support baseball teams, to feed themselves, and those sort of things, and support preacher schools, which they're aware of. So I talked to them about this, After these lessons, everybody wants to shake your hand. They are taking their picture with you. It's embarrassing. You're almost like a rock star or something. I really don't like that part of it. But after this lesson, they all stood up and turned around and walked out. And it was quiet in there. So that was very awkward for me. And we had more sessions to go the next morning. So I really worried about what the next morning would be like. By the next morning, they were all back, Bibles open, ready to talk, and even to discuss that subject again. So, I don't know. They're very open-minded. There are good things happening down there where brethren are coming together and studying about the things they disagree with. Pray that would happen in the United States. I don't know if it will or not, but that's an exciting place to be. That's just a picture of a family that attended one of our worship services there. Not uncommon to see 4, sometimes 5 people on a motorcycle. That's the only transportation they can afford. 200 is a rich man's motorcycle down there. A 150 is more common. They're just little bitty things, but that's how they get around with their families. Artenio feeds everybody that comes to that in his backyard. That's a thatch roof shelter there that you see everybody sitting at a long table that they put together. And his wife and some of the ladies from the church there come out and cook. You can also see the stove there. That's a fire on top of a table. They're more modern than the other ones. They don't have their fire on the ground. Food's passable to me. You eat lots of rice because they're so poor. You always get a little bit of meat, but it's the cuts of meat that we would not serve in the United States. Anything better goes to people that are more wealthy. So that's what you get. You get a lot of plantains, and they're so generous with it. They also have a soup that's famous in Colombia. They make it all over the place. My personal opinion is it's awful. If I'm served it in somebody's home, I can choke it down. If I'm served it in a restaurant, I just pass on it. But anyway, that's enough about me. The last day of our Bible studies there with the group of preachers, Fernando invited us to come and speak at his congregation on Sunday in Monteria. Since we were going to worship in Sahagún anyway that morning, it's a couple-hour drive maybe to Monteria, we were able to attend and speak at his congregation. I'm pretty sure it's probably an institutional group, but we will go and speak anywhere that they'll listen to what we have to say. We also had dinner in his home. And so this is our Sunday travel agenda. You can see down there at the bottom arrow, which is probably black looking from where you are. That's where Monteria is. So we traveled from up at the north down to there and went to his congregation. Then we traveled back up to the red arrow where we worshiped in Rabo Largo. And then we came back down to the purple arrow and stayed in Sarate for the night. I'll tell you a little about those places. This is Monteria. You see the red and blue steps in the middle of the picture. That's downtown Monteria. You take those steps to go up to the church building. And then where the steps end, you scramble over boulders to get up to the little green building, and that's where the church meets up there. Probably would be like a garden shed in your backyard where you would keep your mower, or a little bigger than that. No more than a one-car garage, but that's where they worship. They even have a projector there that they, just like you do, it's modern. And they were very friendly to us. They received us well. There was a group of men outside that building that were sitting around a table that appeared to be gambling and drinking beer. And during the worship service, they got to throwing firecrackers. At first, I thought it was gunfire and interrupted my sermon for a moment, but we got back to it when I figured out it was just fireworks. And then they always want a group picture with the congregation when services are over after you've visited there. We traveled by truck then to Rabo Largo. Rabo Largo is a very small community out in the middle of nowhere, where I visited, I guess that would have been in 2018, January. I was told on the way there that there had been 5 people baptized, 2 of them had died, 1 of them had quit coming, and we were going to worship with the other 2. And so that's what I was expecting, to go to somebody's house, have a worship service with 2 church members, and then we would go on our way. We got to those people's house, and there were over 25 people there. I had to stand in the alley and listen through the window. I didn't even get in the building. they had invited all their friends. As soon as church was over, they said, now we have a Bible study set up tonight, and one of our neighbors has agreed to host a Bible study in their backyard, and you can speak there. So we went to this Bible study in the backyard. Over 100 people showed up. We did 2 sermons, and they wanted to know if we had another one. So I got to speak that night too. It wasn't even my turn, but I got to speak anyway because they wanted a 3rd lesson. When we were all done, the preacher's wife from the Pentecostal congregation in town asked if we would come speak at their congregation the next night. We said, sure, we'll speak at the Pentecostal church. If you'll listen, we'll speak. Brother Calvin spoke there, and he spoke on the plan of salvation. We sat in this, they had walls to their building about this high, and then it's open air up to the roof. So we're sitting outdoors in this thing, and the leadership of this Pentecostal church is all standing and lined up down along the left side. As Calvin speaks, they applaud every point that he does. I mean, it's just rip-roaring applause. They're thrilled with his lesson until he talks about baptism. And then there's this deathly silence. But he kept going, and as he went on, they began to applaud again. When we were done worshiping, we told them we have 2 ladies with us that want baptized tonight, so we're going down to the river, and you're welcome to join us. We go down to the river, and Brother Angel Gabriel, his name is Angel Gabriel. If you don't know that name, he's very well known even in the United States for the work he does in Colombia. Brother Angel was going to prepare them to be baptized. They get another sermon before they get baptized when you travel with him. He stands at the edge of the water and gets his Bible out, and they get a lesson on what they need to do as Christians if they're going to stay strong. It's really impressive. But we notice he's not just teaching this time, he's shouting. So we're wondering, why is he shouting in these people's faces? We got to looking around. There's people on the other bank of the river that have gathered and are watching to see what's going on, and he's preaching to them. They got to hear the plan of salvation too. As he's doing that, one of the ladies from the Pentecostal church comes down and gets in line and says, I need to be baptized too. So we had 3 baptisms. We went back there this year. They can't meet in the house anymore because they need more space. And so they're meeting in this shelter that you see here. They have 7 members now of the Pentecostal church that they baptized and are members of that church. I understand that since we came home, 4 more in the adjoining town have been baptized out of the Pentecostal church. Pentecostal headquarters sent somebody in there to find out what was going on and fired the preacher. Sent in another guy. So exciting things are happening there. That's just pictures of where they're worshiping. Some of their children sitting there lined up. Brother Carl McMurray, if you don't know him, that's the preacher where we attend, was teaching that lesson with Brother Umberto translating for him. Umberto is a comical fellow who not only translates your words, he tries to mimic your actions and your facial expressions. He makes the lessons really interesting, and so we enjoy having him around. This is Brother Albert Montalvo from Montalibano. Albert is not a preacher. Him and I are very similar. I'm not a preacher either. I'm an electrician. So is he. He travels 2 hours on a little motorbike every Sunday to preach in Rabo Largo and travels back home at his own expense. Sometimes he doesn't have enough money for gasoline, and so he will go around to all of his friends and get a few pesos here, a few pesos there, till he can get his tank full to make that trip. He preaches, then he goes and has Bible studies with the Pentecostal brethren, and then he goes back home in the dark. I'm not here to ask for money. I just want to give you an example by talking about him. $50 would make a huge difference in his work. It would cover most of his monthly expenses to do that trip. It's not like here where if you want to support a preacher, you start out talking at how many thousand a month do you need to live. They can live on $500 or $600 down there and live pretty well. $50 will pay his travel expenses. So it's something that even individuals can do to help people down there if you're interested. But they very rarely ask for money. They don't ask for help. after we finished worship in Rabo Largo then, they took the normal worship picture afterwards, and then they said, come on, we need to go. I said, where are we going now? We've been to 3 churches today. It's starting to get dark. Well, we've got a Bible study with some of the Pentecostal brethren. They want to hear. So we went to the Escobar's home, and in their backyard we had this Bible study as the sun went down. With the 3 women that are on the right are members of the Pentecostal church. They asked for this study. And as we taught them about baptism and why it's necessary for salvation, we would have them read the scriptures themselves. The lady at the far right was the one that did most of the reading, and she would sit and read that out of her Spanish Bible, and you could see the light come on in her eyes as she would read those scriptures. She's been in the Pentecostal church her whole life. She's never been taught about baptism being necessary. And she read it for herself out of the Bible. She wasn't baptized that night, but I'm convinced that they will be soon. If not, they know the truth. So we moved on from there and went to our third area of work, which is the yellow area in the middle of your map there. An area called Santa Rosa. The reason we chose to go there this year is our translator that travels with us, name is Santiago. His father is a preacher in that area. He has a congregation in Santa Rosa that numbers about 45 on Sunday mornings. Nice little group. They're actually looking to install elders. We'll talk about that again in a second. But things are going good there. And he preaches at 7 or 8 other congregations around. That's a mountainous area. If you've ever been to the Smoky Mountains, maybe north of here too, in your mountains are similar. The twisty, windy roads where you think you can go in an hour and it takes you 2 hours to get there. That's the kind of area it is. So a while back, he was in a bad wreck and totaled his car. And he didn't have the funds to replace it, so the Anderson congregation was able to replace his car and bought him another one to get around the mountains with. We went to check on his work and see what's going on there. After all, if we're going to send money, I think it's wise that you know. It's commendable that you're allowing me to speak here tonight, just to know where your money meant and that you're spending the Lord's money properly. These are the villages around there that we preached in. Manizales is the red arrow, and if you've talked to anybody at all from Colombia, you've probably heard of that place. Brother Henao, Carlos Henao, is there in the middle, he and his family. Santiago is the one in the gray t-shirt that traveled with us, helped us get around, and translated our sermons for us. And that's their family. They took us out to the local waterfall when we got there that evening because we didn't have a plan that evening. That's the home that they live in. It's a modest home in town. And they also traveled around with that guy. His last name's Valencia. Can't think of his first name at the moment. Brother Henao has done something unusual in poor countries. If you've been associated with the Philippines at all, you know how the requests for money just come and they come and they come. And once they find out that you've helped one guy, there's 10 more guys want. That doesn't happen so much down there. And part of the reason is Brother Henao. He preaches against that. He keeps asking people when he preaches, if the Americans stop sending money, are we going to serve the Lord or are we going to quit? It's not their job to pay for our congregation. It's our job to pay for our congregation. And so that little congregation of 45 there in Santa Rosa not only supports him, they support Brother Valencia. He traveled around with us that week to all these congregations, and that's what he does a lot. He speaks in the little congregations around. That's the Renault that we were able to purchase for him, sitting in front of his house. And then we headed out into the mountains to go to other towns. You can kind of see how people live there in the mountains. That's a view of Santa Rosa from up on top. The first place we went was Villa Maria, which is adjacent to Manizales. They have a cool transportation system in Manizales. They have installed cable cars from town to town. Takes almost no property in the town, just a tower for the wires to hang from. And for about $1, you can ride several miles from town to town and get around that area. It's a really cool and efficient method of transporting people. But anyway, he preaches in Villa Maria. And Oscar Andreas is his name. He travels around and preaches in other towns also. He's a powerhouse in Colombia and a very well-known speaker. He worships with his congregation there in Villa Maria, right downtown, a bad neighborhood, noisy. As you can see, they also have a projector, but they can't leave it in their building because it would be stolen. So they take it home every night after they use it. Next day, we visited Neira. Neira is up in the mountains. It's near a game preserve where the howler monkeys live. If you've heard people talk about them, I guess you can hear them howling at night. Those houses that you can see in the picture and the one we're sitting in are all built up on bamboo stilts, and they take slices of bamboo and cover the walls, and then they smear mud over them to make the walls. So, interesting construction method, but a really fine young man preaching there, Mauricio. You can see him sitting there in the white shirt and his family beyond him. We spent a day with them, and Brother Carl McMurray spoke in their congregation, which meets in that building. That's him speaking, and somebody there that had a baby. I always have a hard time not taking pictures of the kids. The next day, they took us through the coffee country on the way. These mountains that we're in right now working are covered with coffee all the way up to the top. The mountains are so steep in some places that they actually tie ropes around themselves and hang from the top to pick coffee beans and to prune the bushes and things. Those people don't live at the top. At the top of the mountain, there are these mansions you can see in the distance. Those are coffee beans there in the foreground. And then the workers live down at the bottom in places that look more like that. And that's most of the people that we're able to talk to are the poor people. Next day, we visited a town called Huarica. Huarica in that area has had a church in the past that has stopped meeting, and Brother Anau is trying to reestablish that congregation. So he goes out there weekly and studies Bible with a half a dozen people. We were able to spend a day out there and study with them. They wanted to show us their botanical garden, and we went and walked through it. One of the first things we saw were these blue jeans full of dirt with plants growing out of them. I asked them about those, and the only thing they would tell me is they were evangelists from the United States, and then they'd laugh real loud and walk away. I never did get a straight answer why those blue jeans were out there with pictures with the plants growing out of them. But we went out to this shelter that was sitting on stilts over the lake, and we met out there and had a little Bible study and sang praises to the Lord with the brothers in that town. It was really a pretty thing to enjoy. Our translator, again there on the right in the blue shirt, is helping his 87-year-old grandmother who walked about 1.5 miles to get out to that shelter and to worship with us and got tired and couldn't make it back, and he carried her out. I told him he could have gone from hero to villain really quickly if he'd have tripped, but he made it back to the cars with her. He's just a fine young man. We enjoyed. Dos Cabreras is very near Santa Rosa, and they're thinking about starting a congregation there, so they ask us to meet with the members of the church who are wanting to start a congregation there. There's a liberal congregation there that Brother Anau used to speak at some, and then it got turned around by some other people. So just recently he was invited back by some of the brothers there. When he showed up to speak, word had gotten there to some people, I don't know who, but there were a line of men at the front of the building when he got there and asked him what he was doing there. He said, I was invited to come here and speak. They said, you're not invited. Leave. So the same brothers that invited him there to speak have now decided to start their own congregation, and this is the home they intend to meet in. We showed up there. We're just going to encourage them, they said. We're just going to talk and have coffee. I said, okay, great. Be a nice, relaxing evening. We were there for about 10 minutes, and Brother Anau came over to me and said, they would like a lesson for new churches, and we're going to start in about 5 minutes. That's not an unusual thing down there. We'll walk in a congregation, and they'll tell Mac and I, they want 2 lessons, and they want one on this and one on this. So we rock, paper, scissors to see who has to go first, because you always want to go second. Mac preaches more than I do, and the Lord protects me. I get second almost all the time. I don't think that's an accident. But the church in Santa Rosa then meets down that aisle. You can see their sign where it says Iglesia de Cristo over the door. And they actually are big enough that they have Bible class. They have about 15 children in a Bible class every week. That's exciting. It's good to see that. There's a Catholic school in that town, and there's little kids in their Catholic school uniforms all over the place. I really enjoyed them. And one of them was a member of the church there, so she came in. We didn't get to speak in that church. We just went in and took some pictures. I did speak at this house, though. This is a weekly children's Bible study in a member's home. That's the entrance to their home. If you see the little girl down there in the striped dress, she's standing next to an open sewer. And that's normal. Right outside their doors. Their children are sick all the time, and they know that's the reason. They don't know what to do about it. So that's the way they live. This is the group of children that I was privileged to teach. I taught them about Daniel. The adults loved it when I roared like a lion, and the children said they'd heard it before. So. Erica's the little girl in the plaid dress in the front. I fell in love with her. She was very precocious. Wayne Galloway was there with us that day. Maybe you know that name. He works in South America a lot. Him and his wife actually have bought a place now in Bogota where they go for January, February, and March and live down there and work for 3 months. So we got to spend a couple days with him. She likes Wayne and his wife, and there's a picture of her wearing his hat and drinking coffee with the rest of us. So she got her own cup of coffee. We visited a little town called Armenia. This is a church that has been abandoned. It's an institutional church, you would say. And they have asked Brother Anau to come and teach them. So they're preaching there every week now, and they're looking for a better place to worship. That looks like it is a nice building. It's in a terrible part of town. The opening on the front is a great big garage door, and it's so loud in there you can't hear the preacher most of the time. So difficult place to worship. But there was a sister baptized that day while we were there. And that is Brother Valencia and his wife again. He preaches there a lot. He goes to that congregation. So we also visited a town called Anserma. Anserma was one of our last places. It reminded me a lot of home. I guess I was thinking about home a lot anyway because I was getting near the end of the trip, and that starts to wear on your mind when you've been gone for 3 weeks. And then something we do at home, the men that are going to lead our worship service go in another room, and we discuss the plan for the service, and we pray together, and then we come out and lead. And they do that there also. I thought that was so fitting to remind me of home as I was there. It's also the only place down there I've ever been paid to preach. I got a sack of avocados for preaching that morning. When getting on the plane the next day, I don't know what I was going to do with avocados. They said they would save them for me till I came back. We'll see how that works out. But we went back to Santa Rosa then and worshiped on Sunday evening. They don't traditionally meet twice a day like we do, so many of us. They'll meet once on Sunday, and most congregations meet twice during the week, 2 different evenings. So it's a very typical thing. A really nice little group there, and this is the one where these men wanted to study with us after services because they're thinking about installing elders. Almost nobody has elders because as guys get strong enough to become elders, they start traveling around to little towns and preaching. And so the church is growing so fast they can't make elders. And there are almost no second-generation Christians. Everybody's first generation. It's a real challenge to get the church over that hump that they're working on right now. I just put that in to speak to you for a moment about Santiago, who is a young professional, very unusual. Was able to go to college. Because of socialism, he was able to go for free. He's a very successful professional. Lots of businesses come and go down there. He's lost his job 2 or 3 times. But he contacted us when we were planning the trip, and he said, I'm planning to go with you. I had permission from the company where I work, but they changed hands and they fired me. And so he's looking for a job. He said, I'm telling everybody at my interview, I'll come to work for you, but I can't work the first 3 weeks in January. So a company hired him. He went in and worked 1 day and left to go travel with us. He told his boss when he said, yes, you can go, but I can't pay you. You have to pay me. I have rent to pay. And so the guy paid him 3 weeks for doing nothing after working one day. I like to see that happen in the United States. At the last congregation, or the last worship service we had, when I walked out, this was on a truck outside the door, and I thought, how appropriate. Faith doesn't make things easy, it makes them possible. That's what that says. I thought, how appropriate. That trip wasn't easy. It was probably partially because we dropped Calvin and went on our own, and partially because I planned the trip, and I'd never planned a trip like that before. But let me just say, Satan got a hold of me. I was terrified when it was time to go. I just couldn't imagine what was going to go wrong. But I found a way to get through it. I got on the plane. There isn't much you can do once you're on the plane, you know? And that's kind of what you need to do in your life. There are things you can do that you don't know you can do. And if you don't ever get on the plane, you'll never know. It wasn't easy for them either. They live in a difficult place. There's a lot of crime. There's a lot of poverty. They just have difficulties that you can't even imagine. And they make it through. And it's not easy for you either. Things happen in Christ that don't seem possible. The very basis of Christianity starts with an impossibility. That the very creator of the universe would take notice of you and be willing to forgive your sins. How impossible is that? With the minimal or no respect that we've given him, he gives his son to die for us. Impossible things can happen. At least things that appear impossible to us. And I would challenge you today, lift up your eyes and look a little higher than where you've been looking every day. I never imagined in my life that I would travel to Russia and preach in several cities, and that I would travel repeatedly to South America, and that I would have friends that contact me constantly, and that I would speak to you in another state. Never occurred to me. And one of the most common things I hear after I talk on this is, well, I can't do what you do. I understand that. You probably can't. Earlier in my life, I couldn't have done it either. I was busy raising a family. I had obligations. My employer wouldn't let me go. It just couldn't have happened at that time. But when I was younger, I was speaking to another preacher who made a presentation like this at our congregation. And I said, I feel guilty that you go and do all this work and all I do is sit here at home. He said, somebody's got to stay home and earn a living so that I can go. And I really took that to heart. There are things you can do. There are places where $50 would make a big difference. You can help your preacher improve his sermons. Let's do a little experiment. Can you do this? I challenge you to look him in the eye when he's preaching. And when he says something that's right and good and you agree with it, just nod to him. Does that not mean something to you when you're preaching? Wow, and let me give you another warning. Don't do this. I've had people do that to me before. If you disagree with what he says, wait till later to talk to him. And your prayer life can do things for him and for this congregation and for those preachers in South America and the new brothers and sisters we have down there. You can do more than you think you can do. And if you'll open your eyes to the possibilities, you may end up where I am someday. Thank you so much for your good attention.
Able to be involved with in this work of preaching the gospel. And so much of what he has said may feel foreign to our experience or different to our experience, but it is refreshing and edifying to know that we have brothers and sisters in the Lord all over the world and we want to be praying for them. And so thank you so much for the work that you and Brother McMurray do, and all of the labor in which we're able to be a part of. And on that note, we have a week in front of us of Vacation Bible School, and a wonderful opportunity as well to touch lives and touch hearts and be able to shape minds in a way that would lead young and older alike to the gospel and to Jesus Christ. If you would be turning with me to Acts chapter 17 as we think about that. I think all of the announcements for the most part have been made. Please, again, if you have things in the pew where you sit and you like to mark your territory, pick those things up before Vacation Bible School begins, of course, tomorrow. And also would ask you to be praying for all the work that will be involved this week in teaching the gospel. Please pray for the teachers. They certainly will need it. And continue to keep them in mind as you go to the Lord in prayer. Acts chapter 17 is a passage probably most of us are somewhat familiar with, but it comes right after an experience that we see on the part of the Apostle Paul as he was preaching the gospel in Thessalonica. Often we just quote verses 10 and 11, which is certainly worthwhile passages, but if you back up in Acts chapter 17, notice this was their custom to come to the synagogues where they could talk about the gospel and talk about the Christ with those, especially those who had a Jewish background at this time. And notice there at the end of verse 1 in Acts 17, they were there in the synagogue of the Jews, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scriptures. And so he's talking to them about the Old Testament scriptures and how they pointed to the Messiah, how they pointed to Christ. But it goes even further than that. He reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." Not all of them were persuaded, but it does say some of them were persuaded, and they joined Paul and Silas. But then there were those who, for whatever motivation, were wicked in their heart. And you'll notice there in verse 5 that an uproar begins and persecution and oppression, which is often the case. And that leads us to verse 10. Of course, the brethren there want to get Paul out of town. And in verse 10, the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they had arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews just like they had done before. But notice verse 11. He says, "Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether those things were so." As a result of that, in verse 12, "Therefore many of them believed, along with a number of prominent Greek women and men." So here are these very, I think, religious people to some degree who hear about the scriptures, and as a result of hearing about Christ, they searched the scriptures for themselves. They didn't just take their word for it. And the character, the integrity that we see in these folks is really something that should build us up in our faith. Some of the very things that Brother White's already talked to us about tonight. That no matter where we are, we can find those who have this kind of heart. And perhaps we need to ask ourselves, do we have that kind of heart and that kind of mind? Notice just quickly with me what it was that led them to the gospel from their standpoint. Certainly the scriptures are taught, Jesus is proclaimed, but he just mentions that they were noble-minded. I think the New King James Version may use the phrase, they were fair-minded. They didn't have a prejudiced mind. If you have a closed mind, you're not going to listen to anything anybody has to say. He says they were of a noble mind, they were fair-minded. And then notice the next phrase with me. It says they received the word, but look at how they received the word. They received the word eagerly, with great eagerness. You know, sometimes we have to do things, but we're not exactly willing or eager to do those particular things. But these people had an open heart, they had an open mind, and once they saw the truth, they had an eagerness to know truth and to know the Lord. And then going further, not only does it say they were noble-minded or fair-minded, that they received the word with eagerness or with a readiness of mind, they were prepared for the truth, then this statement is made. They were searching or they were examining the Scriptures. That's what leads somebody to love the Lord and to proclaim Him, to receive Him, and to obey the gospel. They wanted to know whether it was true, and when they found it to be true, then they embraced it and they received it and they obeyed the Lord. And so this afternoon, as you think about your condition, maybe it is you've never obeyed the gospel, but you've been searching the Scriptures and examining the Scriptures, and you're eager to receive the truth and obey the gospel, believing in Jesus as the Christ, repenting of your sin, confessing your allegiance and loyalty to Him as the Son of God, and being baptized in water for the remission of your sins. Come now, as together we stand and we sing.